7th of September, 1665. The villagers of Eyam hear of the passing of the tailor's assistant, George Vickers. Shocked to hear of this from those who were crowded around his bedside, they go about their day. Unbeknownst to them, their fate had already been sealed. Within 14 months, all 76 families in the village will have seen the horrors of the plague. This is the true story of how one village in the heart of England showed bravery beyond imagining, saving thousands of lives and experiencing a lockdown few could fathom. The picturesque village of Eyam is situated in the Derbyshire countryside, not far from the famous town of Bakewell tart fame, and around 10 miles southwest of Sheffield. Existing as some form of settlement since the days of the ancient Britons, surrounding moors are suspected of being ancient burial grounds, later mined by the Romans for lead. The village is centred around the St. Lawrence Church, which itself dates back to the 14th century, although there is evidence of an earlier church. Notable monuments of this include a nearly fully intact Anglo-Saxon cross in the churchyard that dates back to the 8th century. For hundreds of years, the people of Eyam existed peacefully, farming the fertile lands and mining the lead like the Romans before them. The population around the second half of the 1600s was at least 350, until the autumn of 1665, where it would begin, a horror unlike any other. Early September 1665, possibly unknowing of the plague outbreak in the capital, the village tailor, Alexander Hadfield, receives a delivery of cloth from London. He tasks his assistant with opening and preparing the materials. The tailor's assistant, George Vickers, opens the package and notices that the cloth inside is wet. With no reason to suspect anything, he places the cloth over his fire to dry. It is only when dried that the fleas hidden inside become active. Unfortunately for everyone in Eyam, these fleas arrive infected with the Black Death. Plague, Bacterium Yersinia, otherwise known as the Black Death, the bubonic plague, and the Great Mortality, has tormented humanity for centuries. The most famous outbreak being that of the 14th century Black Death, which wiped out around 1/3 of Europe's population. Symptoms include swollen, oozing lymph nodes, known as buboes, fever, chills, weakness, and blackened gangrene-like tissue, shortly followed by death. It is primarily spread by fleas and ticks that move between humans and rodent, and London, which was currently experiencing the worst outbreak since the 14th century, was full of them. This is how George Vickers came to be infected, and on the 7th of September, George died in agony, surrounded by those who loved him. The first in a long list of at least 273 recorded deaths. Within 2 to 3 weeks, his 2 stepsons and his immediate neighbour had become infected, fallen sick, and died themselves. Throughout October, the plague spread and infected and killed at least 23 villagers, with multiple families losing up to 5 members in just a few short weeks. All those who had come in contact with the initial infected group. The village, with its tight-knit community, shaken to its core with so much death in such a short period, unsure of what to do, persevered into the cold winter months. It's possible that the winter brought a glimmer of hope. As with the fleas becoming less active in the lower temperatures, the amount of people getting sick and dying had significantly dropped, with less villagers dying between November and the end of February combined than did in previous October, and only 2 meeting their unfortunate end in March. Perhaps the villagers of Eyam believed their torment to be over, but this initial outbreak was only a precursor to the doom that awaited them. As the weather turned and temperatures rose, the fleas became active again. It soon became apparent that the nightmare wasn't over. The village folk, frightened and traumatized, many readying to pack up and leave, did what they had for generations, they looked to their faith. This would be a good time to introduce William Mopperson, the village vicar, who was by all accounts wildly unpopular. He arrived in Eyam from London in 1664, sent to become the vicar of Eyam after the previous beloved vicar, Thomas Stanley, had been officially exiled to the edge of the village after refusing to comply with the 1662 Act of Uniformity. William, knowing of the plague and its contagiousness from London, and seeing the unrest growing among the community, knew that people would leave and inevitably spread the blight to surrounding towns and cities, which up until this point had been spared the brutality of the outbreak down south. In May, William devised a plan. He contacted Thomas Stanley, the ousted vicar, and asked him to help convince the people to stay, to spare their neighbours the same pain as them. Stanley agreed, and at some point in later May, they called a service for all to hear. The two men put their religious and political differences aside, stood together, and delivered the message to the people. A message that unless they seal themselves in and go into quarantine, they would spread the Black Death to thousands around them. These brave men, women, and children agreed not to leave, and essentially wall themselves in to protect those they don't even know. The true cost of their decision would soon come to pass. The summer months of June through August were, for the villagers of Eyam, nothing short of apocalyptic, with multiple people dying every day and more lying sick and in agony. The villagers still alive were living in a nightmare. The village folk had decided on a system of only burying the dead on the family's land by the family, so as not to mix at the church and avoid infection. They also buried their loved ones as quickly as possible so not to be around the disease. One woman, Elizabeth Hancock, had to endure these rules to the extreme, as she tragically lost her husband and 6 children in just 8 days. Burying them herself on the family's land, it is said that folk from the nearby town of Stony watched her dragging them out one by one, too afraid to help her. These graves still stand there today as a sobering reminder of the horror that occurred here. One man, Marshall Howe, survived the plague early on in the outbreak. Believing himself to be immune, he had then gone on to agree to become the gravedigger for the families that had no one left to bury them. A noble agreement, if he had not then gone on to steal from the dead he was putting to rest. But he paid the price, as the items and clothing he stole and brought back to his family, which in turn transmitted the sickness to them. The old exiled Thomas Stanley, who had initially intended to leave, had been convinced to spend his time writing wills for the people of Eyam. William Mopperson saw to making sure the town had supplies and food. He made agreements with the help of surrounding towns for them to leave packages on the outskirts of the village. William came up with the idea of carving holes in rocks to fill with vinegar to put the coins in to pay, sterilizing the coins in the process. Some of these rocks still stand today. The village would still hold church, but now in the open, with families segregated themselves in order to reduce exposure. In the late summer, William lost his wife, Catherine, at only age 27, who spent her time heroically tending to the sick. It is said that she is the one who originally convinced William to stay and help those who needed them. She remains buried to the church, the 200th victim in the blight that swept through this small village. As the summer came to an end, the deaths finally began to slow. William wrote in a letter to his uncle of his wife's passing and spoke of fumigating the cloths in the village. Maybe this was how they slowed the spread. Many still died in the autumn, but as October wore on, these numbers finally lowered. And on November 1st, Abraham Morton breathed his last, the final name in a long list of at least 273 who sacrificed themselves to protect an untold number of lives. It is said that by the 14th month of the outbreak, only 83 villagers remained. In the years since, the legacy of Eyam and its people has survived and only become more widely known. Many say that the acts of the villagers stopped the plague from spreading to nearby towns, cities, and possibly beyond, saving an immeasurable number of lives. The village eventually recovered its numbers over time, but the events of 1665 and 1666 left its impact. The village now stands as a living history book of what happened there. You can still see many of the homes, now known as the Plague Cottages. The village has haunting plaques showing who lived and died in each home. The medieval church still stands tall, decorated with a stained glass window depicting the tale. And just like the village itself, it exists as a monument to the brave people who lost their lives in what only can be described as an act of heroism.